My name is Kathy Creasy. I'm Executive Director for Leadership Development and Discipleship for the Churches of God of Prophecy. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We hope that it will enrich your ministry and better equip you to serve. There's a chat box located to the right of your screen. Please let us hear from you. If you have a comment or solution, please share. If you have questions for the presenter, please ask. At the end of the presentation, there will be a brief question and answer time, so we would like to hear from you. Our guest for today's webinar is Tod Bolsinger. Tod joined Fuller Seminary in 2014 as Vice President for Vocation and Formation and Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. He now serves as Vice President and Chief of Leadership Formation. Tod has authored 3 books, including his latest, Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. This evening, Tod will share insights on leading through disruption and in uncharted territory. Welcome, Tod.
Thank you, Kathy. It's nice to be with you all. My heart goes out to people who are pastors trying to lead in this moment, and that's exactly what I do. My work is with people who are trying to lead change in a disruptive world, and so that's a great joy to be with you all.
Thank you. Tod, we're just going to let you go right ahead, and at the end, we'll come back in and I'll ask you a few questions.
Great, glad to do so. On March 13th, the world changed for me. It was Friday the 13th, and it changed dramatically. I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota at the time. I had just finished a presentation, and I was on my way I was going through the Denver airport. And at the Denver airport, the person who was letting us onto the plane gave us a little stack of Clorox wipes and told us to wipe down the plane on the way in. I had never once been asked to be on the maintenance crew of a plane before, at least even for my own little seat, but I realized the world was in a different place. Probably around that same time is when the world changed for you too. Earlier that week on Tuesday, I was sitting in a senior administrators meeting, and we were talking about the fact that a committee of folks at the school that I serve at Fuller Theological Seminary were already making plans to go 100% online for the spring semester because of this thing called the coronavirus. And not only that, but we would be probably working from remotely from home. And those of us who traveled would have to be grounded. We wouldn't be allowed to be doing any travel. Now, it's a school that's been mostly online for a number of years. The online part wasn't very disruptive. And even the part of working remotely wasn't terrible. A number of my 60 staff already work remotely around the country. What was really difficult was how were we going to keep serving churches if we weren't going to be able to travel? I travel about 100,000 miles a year on air travel alone. And so I found myself resisting the change. I literally said, I wonder if we are overreacting at this point. And what's interesting about that for me as I look back is that I'm the guy whose job is about leading change. That's what I do. I help form leaders to faithfully navigate change in a disruptive and changing world. And here I was, the person who was the most disrupted at that moment and the most upset about change. And I remember thinking at the time that this is probably something that we'll work on next week at our next Tuesday staff meeting. And on Wednesday, I got on a plane and flew to Nashville, Tennessee. On Thursday, I flew to Sioux Falls. I did my presentation on Friday morning and then got on the plane in Sioux Falls to head to Denver. By the time I was in the Denver airport and they were handing me those Clorox wipes, I was no longer thinking that we were overreacting. I knew this COVID-19 thing was taking on a much more significant impact to people around the world. And by the time I hit my Lyft driver in Los Angeles to take me back to my home in Pasadena, it would be the last time I would be in a Lyft. That would be the last time that I've been on a plane since then. And I realized the world really had changed dramatically. What had also changed dramatically was my own attitude. I'd gone from the person who was convinced on Tuesday that we were overreacting to mobilizing my team for a big disruption and change on Friday. By Sunday, most of the churches that I worked with and most of my clients were all online. They were broadcasting services on Facebook Live. They were using this thing called Zoom. And everybody was asking questions about whether or not we were going to be able to hunker down and make it through this crisis. I remember one person said to me, I hope we just don't have to cancel Easter. I'm thinking about that for a second. Not having Sunday services on a campus would mean canceling the resurrection, but that's what it felt like. It was a dramatic upheaval. I had 15 speaking engagements all canceled in the very next week. And we found ourselves talking to people across the country about how to navigate this change. If there's one thing we've learned is that the only thing constant about change is that it is speeding up. And we are in the middle of a crisis that we need to learn to navigate. My work on adaptive leadership is built on the work of Ronald Heifetz. And Ronald Heifetz out of Harvard University in 2009 wrote an article called How to Lead Through a Permanent Crisis. And what he talked about was he used an analogy that I think is helpful for moments like this. The first analogy is that he basically said, think about the way that a medical crew has to mobilize in a crisis. There's two stages. Stage one is when the person is wheeled into the emergency room. It's the acute crisis, the acute stage. You just want to stabilize the patient. You want to protect. You want to buy time. You want to be able to make sure that everybody survives. But in a good, healthy situation, a situation that takes advantage of this moment, that it heeds the warning sign, there's also an adaptive stage. It's when everybody is stabilized, but they don't allow the crisis to fade into the background. The adaptive stage is where you address the underlying issues that caused the crisis in the first place. Now, this doesn't exactly apply to something like a pandemic. We didn't cause it. But it does allow us to ask some questions about the impact in our churches. You see, the adaptive crisis is where we address the underlying conditions that we've not had the will to confront before the crisis. It's the moment when Ronald Heifetz says, if you pay attention, you can hit the organizational reset button and you can come out healthier than ever before. Now, let's be clear, this is hard to do. When we're in a crisis, it feels like it's acute all the time. We just want to get back to normal as fast as we possibly can. But getting back to normal might actually miss the opportunity. And so, this is what I would like to talk with you today. How do you not waste a crisis? How do you learn to lead differently when you're in a moment that is completely unexpected, that is in completely uncharted territory, where you actually feel like you are off the map and that you have no map and maybe not even a compass to go by? How can this actually become your best moment? Well, here's one of the ways to think about this. Today, somebody said, we are in 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We are in a health crisis, a global pandemic. We are in a global recession that in some places is moving into a depression, an economic recession. And we're also in a moment of deep social uprising and protest against racial injustice. So all of a sudden, we find ourselves leading our people through a time that nobody has been through before. So at this very moment, this crisis calls out the very best in us in leadership. So, how do we make sure that we don't waste it and indeed use it in a deeper way? Here's one way to think about it. If you're familiar at all with the coronavirus, as most of us are, we know that the coronavirus and COVID 19 is particularly dangerous for people with underlying conditions. If have a healthy body, you might be able to survive an infection relatively well. One of my friends, she was one of the first people who was infected. A colleague of mine is a pastor colleague, and she was on a ventilator, and she's come off, and she has done really well. And we've all given thanks to God for her health. But a huge part of it is that she was young and healthy. What happens if instead you have a number of underlying conditions, like my father, who's 78 years old, who literally is homebound because he's got bad heart, he's got diabetes, he's got neuropathy, he struggles with obesity. He's got all the different experiences, the underlying conditions that make it particularly dangerous. If the wrong delivery person showed up to bring him food without a mask on, it could be deadly for my dad. Well, what's happened for most of us in this time of uncharted territory is that we've begun to recognize that the pandemic has brought up to the surface the underlying conditions that are already present in a number of our churches. So think about this for a second. If you're listening to this, maybe you could jot a few down. What are some of the things that have come to the surface that now you can see dramatically as making your church more at risk during this time of crisis? What are some of those underlying conditions? Let me mention four that show up every single time I ask this question. Remember how I mentioned that I had 15 speaking engagements canceled? Well, I've now had over 50 of these webinars. And every time I ask this question about underlying conditions, and four things come up. Number one, many of our churches are struggling with a lack of deep discipleship, the kind of deep embedded faith that can make a church persevere through crisis and come out and use the crisis as an opportunity to witness to the presence of Christ in our lives, a lack of deep discipleship. Oftentimes, there's been also a lack of deep community that keeps people connected and unified in times of disconnection and division. Some of us are just nervous that because it's our worship services might be on Zoom, it's easy for someone to click off and go to another worship service, and we might lose them forever. Um, are there deeper connections than just whatever we experience in a Sunday morning worship service? Third, a lack of extensive leadership capacity. If more and more of our churches need to be done in smaller gatherings or in different settings, if we not maybe not be able to gather on Sunday mornings in the same way or use huge worship services, well, then we're going to need more leaders than ever to lead the church and the mission of the church forward. Do we have the extensive leadership capacity? Many of us acknowledge that that's an underlying condition. So, a lack of deep discipleship, a lack of deep community, a lack of extensive leadership capacity. And also, for most of us, our churches were formed during a day where the church had cultural privilege, the culture supported Christianity. And so it's hard then to feel more marginalized. It's hard to be able to speak prophetically for our brothers and sisters who are marginalized because we're just not used to the experience of being disrupted like we are. And that when you've been shaped in a place of safety and protection and privilege, it oftentimes makes it really difficult to be people who speak prophetically, collaborate with others for justice, and work for the common good. So, a lack of deep discipleship, a lack of deep community, a lack of extensive leadership development, and the shape and being shaped by cultural privilege are all kind of the things that have been underlying conditions that have shown up before. When you think about trying to address those underlying conditions, when you think about trying to take advantage of this moment, if you will, to address those, to take on the adaptive challenges, well, what kind of leadership do you need? One of my mentors put it this way. He learned from a Marine Corps jet fighter pilot this little phrase: at the moment of crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You will default to your training. The moment of crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You default to your training. And most of us weren't trained for this kind of crisis. And we really weren't trained for the adaptive stage of the crisis. We're pretty good if you put us into an emergency room as chaplains who care for people. We're pretty great if we've got to hold the hands of people who are going through loss. We're well trained at what it's like to be with people in the acute stage. We're good at helping people survive and spiritually survive those moments. But what about how to thrive and grow because of those moments? That's the place where we haven't been trained very much. What's helpful for us at this moment is to consider what Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky call adaptive leadership. So let me leave you with this way of thinking about your problems, and then Kathy and I can have more of a conversation. Whenever you have a moment facing a crisis, as soon as everything calms down and you're at what we call the adaptive stage, ask yourself, can an expert solve this problem? Can an expert solve this problem? So if you need someone to help you with your technology, the answer is yes. If you need someone to, it's hard, but I work at a seminary. We teach you how to do that. So the answer is yes. If you need someone to walk with somebody through pain and loss, well, yeah, the answer is yes. Got experts who can do that. If you need someone to be able to counsel someone in a time of depression or deep discouragement, the answer is yes. These challenges that an expert can solve are called technical problems. They're the application of current knowledge, skills, and tools. And experts solve them. But if you find yourself sitting at this moment trying to figure out how do we lead the church in the mission of God through 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time that nobody's ever been through before? What if you find yourself trying to ask yourself, what does it mean to be the church when we do not know what tomorrow, let alone next month or next year will be? That the expert can't solve it. It can't be solved with one's existing knowledge, skills, and tools. So it requires people to do a very disturbing thing. They need to make a shift in values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior. They need to make a shift. They need to reframe the moment, and they need to learn in real time, in the middle of the moment. They need to be ready to face loss. There's stuff we're going to have to leave behind, things that are dear to us. And at the same time, there's things we have to hold on to, which means we're going to leave other things behind because there's shifts we're not going to be willing to make because they're core values for us. And it's going to reveal gaps in behavior and values and strategies that we have to negotiate. It requires learning, it results in facing loss, and it reveals gaps in behaviors or values or strategies we have to negotiate. And those kinds of challenges that an expert can't solve, they require us to learn, they require us to face loss, reveal gap challenges. An adaptive leader is a leader who stands in front of a group of people and says, I don't know, but God has called us forward. We're going to learn as we go. It's going to be hard. We're going to have to leave some things behind. Jesus talked about wineskins that needed to be left behind if you have the new wine of the Spirit. Matthew talks about the loss of a grain of wheat that falls to the earth and dies so that it can bear much fruit. There'll be learning, there'll be loss, and you'll have to navigate competing values. You'll have to make hard decisions. Those issues are the issues in front of us that hold us together and help us think about a different way of leading in this moment. Let me challenge you with one last thought. A disciple is a learner. That's the Greek root word behind it. So for us to be told that at this moment, we've got to humbly stand before a group of people and say, I don't know, and I'm not the expert, but I'm going to lead the learning is a profoundly Christian thing to do. Eric Hoffer, an author, once said, in times of great change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. So my encouragement to you as you go through this season of time is to lead the learning. Try not to lean back on your training. Your expertise is for a day that doesn't exist anymore. Don't focus on going back. Focus on moving forward, learning, facing loss, navigating competing values, and moving into the mission that God has given you. I'll stop there and we can have a bit of a conversation.
Excellent. Very, very thought-provoking, Todd, and very challenging. And I hope that I can ask questions that will help our listeners to pull out even more of what you've been saying today. So if I fail to ask a pertinent question, I'm going to let you answer it anyway. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as you were talking, you one of the things that you mentioned when you were talking about acute versus adaptive, in and all of us do want to go into that adaptive mode. That is our heart, not just to stabilize, but our heart is really to do this, but it's very much against our nature sometimes. But you
Mhm.
mentioned in the adaptive, you mentioned the will to confront, being able to hit the organizational reset button. I think I'm speaking primarily to our pastors and asking the question for our pastors, but I think also for leadership throughout our organization, uh, the will to confront. This may seem a simplistic question, but what, what, where do we have to go to get that will to confront? What's involved in having that will to confront, which I think is a problem in the church for centuries.
Yeah, yeah. It's a great question. It's really great. So here's an interesting thing. Let me just encourage you to think about this. The way you develop the will to confront is not by standing up and saying, "We're going to confront a problem." The way you
Right.
discover the will to confront is actually by making observations about the problem. It's what we
Hmm.
just did. What do you think are some of the underlying conditions? And leading that conversation with your leaders and with your congregants to ask, what are some of the things that we have an opportunity to look at right now that we've noticed during COVID that we didn't notice before? Um, that brings the shared experience to the surface.
Hmm.
It's what the leaders in adaptive leadership call giving the work back to the people. And so now it's not just the
Excellent.
leader's job, it's everybody's.
I love how you shifted that and how you helped us to shift it rather than us taking responsibility, but being humble enough to ask those we serve their observations and helping them think on the challenges that we face and come work with us to come up with the solutions. So, Todd, you were talking about how not to miss a crisis by considering the underlying conditions. And all four of those underlying conditions are very pertinent to our local churches. I wanted you to address the first one, the lack of a deeper discipleship. And can you uh, I know it's simplistic, but can you give us, our pastors who are listening, just a few pointers on how to address this problem that seems to be very inherent in our local churches?
Yeah. So one of the ways to think about this from an adaptive leadership frame is that the first principle was give the work back to the people. So get them involved in the conversation, making observations, participating with you. The second thing to recognize is just a really simple little phrase. Today's problems are built on yesterday's successes. Today's problems are built on yesterday's successes. For most of us, for most of the 90s and the early part of the 20th century, we focused really heavily on making our Sunday morning worship service the best it possibly could be. So, good preaching, good music, great greeter teams, great hospitality. What that created literally was a value of being like as seeker friendly and user friendly as possible. All really good successes, good things. The problem is what it meant is that the discipleship, the capacity to develop your own deeper faith in Christ and your capacity to hold the community in relationship, being members of one another, has suffered a bit. So I've said to some people, it's like the church became a really great set of restaurants, and now almost nobody knows how to cook anymore, and so or feed themselves. And so
Yeah.
part of what we have to do, we have to recognize this gives us a moment to turn the church into a cooking school. All right, how do you
Mhm.
feed people spiritually? How do you help them feed each other? How do you help them feed their families? And where this shows up really is like say in youth and children's ministry. If you can't have
Mhm.
children's ministry programs, with great VBS programs and water slides and bounce houses and and great, wonderful programs led with energetic volunteers, well then now what you got to do is teach parents how to disciple their children. So this
Mhm.
does give us a moment, an opportunity to recover some things that are the only a struggle today is because we were successful at the other things.
A great insight and so helpful, and one that I know our churches are really they're grappling with now. I'm very proud of them for that, especially in the area of giving back to our families, the discipleship of their children. I've
Mm,
loved seeing that during this time of crisis. Well, I
beautiful.
know I'm just picking your brain, but let's go on one more into that deeper community, because
Mhm.
also I think that we as an organization were very committed to deep community and small group ministry early in our formation. We did lose that. And so now we're trying to regain it. So give us some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, so just two thoughts about this. Again, thinking about how do you give the work back to the people? How do you keep our core values center? Like, so what we want is
Mhm,
healthy adaptations of our core values. So if your denomination organization has a deep connection to a history of small group discipleship and
mhm,
small group community, this is a great moment to like tell those stories from the past and to remind
mhm,
people that this is really who we are. And that it's a little bit like when you gather around a family dinner table and you ask grandma to tell some stories about the family that remind the next generation, hey, this is what it means to be a Bolsinger. This is what it means to be a Creasy. This is what it means to be in our family, right? And I think there's a moment to do so. And especially around Christian community, where so much, again, the program community became a program that needed things like a
mhm,
fellowship hall, right, in order to have community. Well, we start realizing that community is really seen in Jesus with a group of 12 people gathered
mhm.
together around a common table and a common mission that they did on the road. Jesus' ministry was more like a camping trip than it was like a convention hall. And I think there's a moment
Right.
to recover some of that.
Mhm. Excellent. Excellent. Another thing that I think was challenging to me, and the quote, and I won't repeat the quote, but how do we become better learners rather than
Mm,
focusing on being learned, being
yeah.
knowledgeable? How do we as
Yeah.
leaders do that?
I think one of the reasons that way we do it is by modeling the learning. So to say,
Mhm,
be a disciple means to be a learner. So I want to be the chief learner. So if
mhm,
I'm the pastor of my congregation, I want to invite people to learn with me, and I want to learn from you. And like, I'll give you a good example. One of the places that I think we can do a lot better is learning to listen to people who are familiar with this world we're in, a technology world. How
mhm,
about younger people? A world where the
mhm,
church doesn't seem to have much power and influence. How about the parts of the church where there hasn't been much power and influence? Like some of the most beautiful places in the church today are in the African American church, the Latino
mhm,
church, the immigrant church. When we start collaborating with other churches and learning together, then the whole body of Christ grows. It's what Jesus said. The body
mhm,
helps each build each other up. And that's what, Paul wrote to Ephesians. We build each other up in Christ. So I think that leading the learning by the leaders modeling that is the way to help the whole
mhm.
culture be like
Okay, that's excellent. Todd, I want to thank you so much. You've given us so many nuggets, and we could spend so much time delving into this. But thank you for sharing with us, and I hope that we can work with you to get together again. We'd love to have you again as a guest if that would be feasible in your schedule, which I know is very busy. um, I wanted to say to our audience that please look at Todd's book, Canoeing the Mountains, or listen to some of his YouTube presentations to other groups of people and gain some more. And if you have more questions, let's hear from you, and we will schedule Todd again to delve deeper into this significant subject, not just because we're in a crisis now, but because we want to be not just we want to be adaptive. We want to use this time that God has given to us as a church to truly consider who we are and how we can better accomplish our mission here on earth. So, Todd, thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to say to us before you say goodbye?
Here's one way that people can get some easy resources that I do, which is if you
Okay.
want to send a text on your phone, just send the word uncharted, like uncharted territory, UNCARTED, uncharted to 66866. That's too many sixes in a row
6
for a pastor. 666.
Okay.
Send the word uncharted to 66866 and you'll connect you to all of my resources.
Okay, we will put that up on our website so that it's pretty simple, but we might get mixed up, so we will put it up. Thank you again, Todd, and God bless you so much in what you are doing. Very relevant for our church, and we
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Kathy. Yeah, nice to be with you.